Hey everybody, we are still in session 4 and I'm excited to talk about this particular presentation called Making Your Case, which is based upon George Fichet's article, which I know that we've asked all of you to read. And just to make sure that you know what I'm talking about, here's the front page of that article. If you haven't yet read it, would commend this to you and even perhaps to do a reread of it. It culminates for me in what are 7 critical points for how it is that we as chaplains can make our case or write your own case, which is where I hope to get us through this presentation today. So my picture is not on this. George Fichet's is, because it does certainly pay homage to George and his contributions to how critical it is that we build the research literature through our cases. So I am trying to motivate you to create a burning platform to write a case if you have not done so already. So if you read the article, you know that there are 7 things that George articulates for us to do. And he draws from other literature to get to these 7 points. So the first is, what is your point? Second is, how do you, among your interprofessional colleagues, make your case? And that, for me, is essential to perhaps the audience that you might be writing for. Like any good story, what are the details? Who are the characters? What's the setting? Important to this is, what's the chaplain-patient relationship? How do you become a character in this person's particular story? Fifth is a spiritual assessment. Of course, if you use a published spiritual assessment, what is that? And to cite that. If you don't, would invite you to articulate the spiritual assessment you use as best as possible. Coming back to the main point that you were making in the beginning, how do you wrap this up to make your ultimate point? And I'm going to be highlighting aspects of the video that I hope you watched related to making your case. It's a television news segment featuring a guy named Keith Simons that I met and about whom I wrote a case that will be included in a book coming out late this summer, early this fall, how chaplains are involved in healthcare decision making. And the ultimate point that mine is making is how essential narrative is to the work we do. And that, I think, leads me to this last point, is the theory discussion. For example, some of the people I will cite are folks like Arthur W. Frank, professor emeritus from the University of Calgary, who has made, I think, big contributions to narrative. But I also rely upon people like Rita Sharon or Alistair McIntyre or Lindo Garro and Cheryl Mattingly, people who, from not just chaplaincy, but from certainly other professions, that lead us to how critical narrative is to the work we do. So just kind of get to the nitty gritty here a little bit. First, again, what's your point? And for your case, what are the things you want to say about this person that would be essential to highlight and to lift up? What's the drama? In the case of Keith, what happened for him was he had pretty extensive oncology kind of surgery in the community setting, and how I met him in the academic healthcare setting was he enrolled in a clinical trial. His community oncology surgeon had said to him, your choices are either enroll in hospice or enroll in this clinical trial, and he chose the clinical trial. So again, who's the audience that you're writing for? And I think however you write your case or make your PowerPoint presentation will depend on that, of course. Background. It's critical that you paint a picture of that particular person. And always, I know perhaps you know this, given how HIPAA is such a significant part of our lives, and in the world of research, our accountability to keeping people anonymous and the essentiality of confidentiality is important. What was unique about my situation is that I chose to write about Keith after he had died. So I contacted his wife and 2 adult children who are mentioned in the case to ask for their permission. Not only did they give me permission, but they asked that I change everything back to listing Keith's real name. I had de-identified him, and I think I called him David. So I did all that and put the details back in, and they did something in research we call member checking, and they confirmed all the details as I had written them and said, not only do you have permission, but you have our blessing to do this. So in that, I'm going to show you a separate PowerPoint I'm putting together But this is Keith again. So if you watch the video, this was a screenshot of the video. And here's another image where I'm trying to talk about the medical circumstances and Keith's understanding of it, and then some aspects about Keith, who he was as a director of a nonprofit, as well as who he was as an American football player, things about his life before he died and things that were part of his history that helped form him. Of course, your relationship is important to talk about with that person because there was a motivating factor that led you to write about this case and to detail that out to some extent and to recreate the dialogue. And of course, that's always going to be approximation, so do as best you can for that. Critical to our work as chaplains is that spiritual assessment. And a spiritual assessment that I use talks about the patient's understanding and about their illness and the circumstances, how they define family or source of support. What are those things that provide angst, suffering, distress, to list those, as well as those things that provide a positive source of coping, however they would define religion or spirituality. And I think this is, for me, critical, is what are their goals of care? I think, especially when I talk about narrative or story, and I don't try to solve that debate between how we define narrative and story, because there's a lot of that out there in the literature. But for me, there certainly is the immediate content of somebody's, where they grew up, their education, their job, their family, as well as what we encounter as chaplaincy oftentimes is what is the overall arc, the future that they see happening in their illness. And then finally, I think it's important to hear how they make sense of their illness. Certainly in the cancer world, most often we hear the metaphor of the military metaphor of they're fighting this, but we certainly hear things like journey, that I'm on a journey with this illness. But there are other ways that people describe, and that's for me important to name those metaphors, those analogies, or those very descriptive words about how it is and how that perhaps unfolds. So as we're kind of wrapping this particular presentation up, I just want to mention how important the wrap up is. Coming back to your point, in the case that I wrote about Keith, I described an intervention that I utilize now called mutual expressive writing. And this is based on something comes from Pat Schneider. If you're familiar with the Amherst Writers and Artists method, it's a way that people can be together, and it embraces the importance that everybody is a writer and everybody has a voice. So I seek to bring that into the environment, and in working with Keith, this intervention became a really powerful tool of expression and meaning. And again, as we mentioned, what does it mean to integrate some of the narrative and theory? And here's where I mention Pat Schneider's work. And finally, I think the thing that I want to amplify the most is that you can do this. Whether you create your own case review club or case club in your setting, I think it's important for us to talk about the work we do in a creative way and then to write about it. It's a way that we make meaning. We figure out how it is that we do this work and how we do it together. And the final thing I want to say is just a shameless plug for this book. I hope this is in your library and that you've read it. And if it isn't yet, I would commend it to you, this book that Steve Nolan and George Fichette put together. All right, thanks. That's all I've got for now. Talk to you soon.